Thank you very much. Thank you. We have a little bit of time for questions before wrapping up this panel. And I have a few that folks have turned in, and I guess there's a couple more coming. Here's an interesting question about charters. And this person has written, given that there's no turning back on charter schools, are there ways that charters could become the heart of the community, part of a larger democratic system? What would have to change about the way charters operate for that to happen? Throw that to both of you.
So I really wish Debbie were still here. We discussed this at length last night over dinner. So I will invoke her and as well as give you my my sense of things. So as many of you know, there are at least two kinds of charters, right? There are the kinds of charters that Al Shanker originally envisioned that are very much organic and rooted in the priorities and the values of certain communities, right? These are homegrown schools, right? And then we have large franchises and large chains and large corporate-funded charters that look very different, and that import a set of values and priorities and curriculum into a community that's not necessarily reflective of what the community wants. And I think if we are able to differentiate between these two, and this is what Debbie was saying last night, if we're able to differentiate between the two types of charters, and she was recommending that we refer to possibly independent charters versus the charters that are proliferating right now, we'll be able to identify with which type of charter school we are referring to, or which type of charter school we want for our communities. I think that, that there's a growing sort of disillusionment. When I interview people in Oakland Unified School District, I'm actually studying their full-service community schools reforms right now. I have been for the last few years, and Oakland Unified has a very large population of charter schools. And many people want to distinguish when they talk to me about what kind of charter school they wanted or which ones they're referring to. I think it can help people if you can identify which you mean and what you want and what you mean by a charter school. So I think they're here to stay. So it's a matter of what you do with them and how you try to differentiate them.
I would add, so I agree with the point of making a distinction of kinds of charters. I would just also add that I was just talking to a group of educators who were starting a new charter school in the Bronx, and they said, the school's not even created yet, and they have hundreds of applicants. They have a waiting list already. Sight unseen. What does that tell you? It tells you that there are people desperate for better alternatives. Right? It is a mistake to villainize the parents who want better schools, because guess what? Middle-class parents always have alternatives. Right? They'll create them if they don't exist. And so I think the real challenge, in my opinion, is how do we ensure accountability on charter schools? Accountability for who they serve, right, so that they're not pushing kids out that are more disadvantaged. Accountability on the money that they receive, because there's been a lot of cases of corruption, but also very little transparency in dollars per student. I think some of the high-performing charters are spending considerably more than public schools, and there's no attention at all to how the money's being used, what it's being used for, and much more accountability with respect to how they impact other public schools. What I'm seeing in New York, but I see it happening here in Washington and in other cities like Chicago, is charter schools are being opened up, and it's deliberately causing a low enrollment in neighboring public schools that were high functioning until then. This is not a wise use of public resources, right, to address these needs. So I don't want to have I think that it's important to have a nuanced view of charters and what they are, what they represent, rather than generalizing. But at the same time, I'm very concerned about the lack of public accountability and transparency about what's going on there.
I think one of the areas that we see as very interesting in terms of there's a tension clearly between a local and federal role. And The civil rights community has been particularly vocal up into, including today, where they have seen the federal role from Brown versus Board through the original Title I as a very positive force for equity, forcing recalcitrant local school boards and recalcitrant communities to provide more equitable schooling. And yet, so in the conversation that we've had this morning, there's a real focus on local control. Clearly, Debbie, in her comments, emphasized that, at a very, very school level. And certainly, Pedro, in your descriptions of the schools that you visited and that were that you highlighted, there's a sense of local site-based control. How do you resolve that tension if you do, or how can you address that? And Tina as well. You talk a lot about the impact of federal policies as being inequitable.
So I'll briefly, I think the federal role is still very important for civil rights enforcement. I wanted you to recommend a report released this week by Catherine Lehman. She is the new head of the Civil Rights Division within the U.S. Department of Education. She's excellent. She's the best thing to happen in that Department of Education since Obama was elected. She has released a number of, it's the first time since she was there that you hear open discussion about equity and about the disparities, all coming from her office. And so I think the federal government has to play a role in shining the light on violations of civil rights. Now, I would like to see them also go back to the original intent of ESEA, which was to make up for, compensate for disadvantage, which it's ironic that we call these civil rights groups that are defending No Child Left Behind. I think that's a misnomer, right? This is Ed Trust, right, and a couple of their allies. And what we're going to try to do soon is to organize another part of the civil rights community to say, look, there's another perspective out here that's focused on the opportunity to learn, right, which has been denied to many kids across the country, and which this particular group, that calling themselves the civil rights advocates, has not spoken to at all. So I just say there's a lot more to be said about civil rights and education in the federal role.
Yeah, I second everything that Pedro just said. I think that I'm oftentimes asked, especially by students, well, so then if you study sort of decentralized and centralized policy structures, what are you for? Are you for or against centralization? And I tell them I think that's the wrong question. I think that there are certain forms of discretion that need to be left to the federal and state authorities, and other forms of discretion that need to be left to the local communities. So very much like Pedro was saying, in terms of oversight, in terms of monitoring, in order to enforce certain forms of civil rights compliances and things like that, there's absolutely a role for a top-down authority there, absolutely. In terms of what can be locally controlled, the types of other types of inputs and curricular decisions and instructional decisions can very much be still relegated to local authorities.
The folks who advocate most strongly for choice frame it as a small d democratic, that it's the sort of the epitome of small d democracy. What's your take on that?
So I think we need to define what we mean by democratic, and there are different definitions and different forms of democracy. And if we're talking about deliberative democracy or participative democracy or neoliberal sort of marketized notions of democracy, each one of them carries with them very different implications and carries with them different implications for the role of the market, right? And what the relationship is between the market and the civic society. So I would encourage us all to, when we're talking about democratic education or democracy in general, to really be specific about what we mean by democracy, and there are multiple forms of it, and I think that can help further the conversation.
I would add that a choice in a choice system, there are certain assumptions about how you choose and how you participate. One is that you have access to information in your language you speak. The other is that you have access to transportation to get to schools. And what we now know from several choice systems that are in cities across the country is that almost in every city, it's exacerbated inequality, right? That is that those who choose are those, and even those who participate in lotteries tend to be much better off than those who don't. And so you end up with even more of a because already we have a two-tiered system, a private one for the affluent, a public one for the poor. Then within that public one, there are the magnet schools, the exam schools, and now increasingly the number of cream schools, and then the large number. In New York City, there are 10 schools in the city that where kids who are released from Rikers are allowed to go, right, are allowed to be re-enrolled. All of those are failing schools. Those are also the schools that serve disproportionate numbers of immigrant, undocumented kids, homeless kids, you can go on down. Those schools are, those kids are not being chosen, because the other side of this choice business is that it's not always families that choose, the schools choose who they will take and who they won't take. And some people are a lot less desirable when it comes to that. So choice has to be qualified by what are the provisions for equity in a choice system? How do you make sure that you don't end up with what you've seen in many cities where the neediest kids being concentrated in a smaller number of schools that are under-resourced?
We're going to wrap up now. Thank you very much to our panelists, Pedro, Tina, and Debbie in absentia.